Welcome to EdSpace, in which we discuss some of the highlights of the week's news with our editor, Sukumar. Thank you for joining us, Sukumar. Let's start with FDI reforms. So yesterday, the government introduced a new wave of relaxations for the rules on foreign direct investment. And this time, they were focusing on pension fund managers and insurers. So can you just tell us, to start with, a little bit about these reforms? And also, given that there are some elections coming up, what's the reaction likely to be from the opposition parties and also from potential investors?
Of all the things that the government has announced in the recent weeks, I think insurance, the foreign investment in insurance is probably the one for which most people have been waiting for the longest time. It's been spoken of for at least the past decade. Ever since India allowed private insurers, I think there have been efforts to try to raise the cap on foreign investment. And the reason for that is that insurance is a very, very capital-intensive business, and you need a lot of equity for it. And many of the Indian companies have not been able to bring in that kind of equity. So if you look at the performance of most private insurers in the country, most of them are losing money. All of them are in the red. They have accumulated losses. They continue to lose money. So there was a strong case for increasing the cap. The problem is it's just the cabinet that's cleared it, which is why I'm a little surprised by the euphoria that I've seen around everywhere saying that, this is brilliant. It's good. It would be brilliant if it passes through Parliament, and you don't know whether the opposition will play ball. I think the government has made two gambles. The first is that all these measures will in some way boost investor sentiment and result in a growth in the economy, helping them do a lot of populist things that they will, I think, shortly do, thereby winning them an electoral dividend. Right? That's gamble one. Gamble two is that the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the main opposition, will listen more to reason and go along with the insurance and pension reforms, because I think deep down these are things that the Bharatiya Janata Party also believes in. But the issue is, will they behave like a responsible opposition, or will they just be opportunists who beat down the government because this is another opportunity to beat down the government? And that to me is a far more significant gamble, because if you look at the recent track record of the opposition party in India, I think they've been more opportunists than long-term players.
And what about the reactions from overseas, from potential investors?
I think investors are happy, but again, they're waiting to see whether this goes through Parliament, because they can't do anything. But they're happy because, especially the insurance companies, they've been asking for it for a long time. And I think everyone's missing one more fundamental point, which is, if you look at the biggest problem that India has, it's infrastructure. All infrastructure projects need long-term funds. In any market in the world, the longest term funds come from the insurance companies, because they're the only guys who have funds with those kind of windows. So if you have a thriving and healthy and prosperous insurance sector, it means there is enough long-term funding for infrastructure. So I think that is a very, very significant positive of that. Now, of course, for that to happen, Parliament will have to clear this.
Okay, and then a slightly less controversial move was the approval of the Companies Bill. Can you just tell us about the import of a bill like the Companies Bill?
I think it was about time they changed the Companies Bill, because we'd been working with a bill which dated back to 1956, and the world has changed since. They've made a lot of little changes over a period of time. They've allowed e-filings and other things. But two or three very significant things that I think they do. One, they are focusing on reducing instances of corporate fraud, making companies more responsible to minority shareholders, more responsible as well as more responsive to minority shareholders, more accountable. They're making the boards more accountable. India has this very, very cozy culture of independent directors serving for like 20 years and 30 years and so on. They're limiting that. So if you look at what they're focusing on transparency, they're focusing on investor protection, they're focusing on preventing frauds, they're focusing on corporate governance. So they're looking at all the right things. It's a law. It's a bill that, if passed, will also allow class action suits, which is another form of investor and consumer protection. So I think it just means the legal and regulatory regime under which companies operated in this country suddenly moved up a level, which is brilliant. It was about time that it happened, because if you look at some of the companies in this country, we have a lot of good companies in this country which are globally competitive, which have actually gone out and acquired companies overseas. But all of them were working in a legal and regulatory regime which dated back to 1956. That's changed.
And then in another slightly FDI-related subject, Kingfisher Airlines, after the last round of reforms, which had included aviation FDI reforms, had hoped that that might turn around their fortunes a little bit, but that doesn't seem to have happened. In fact, this week's been pretty disastrous for the airline. So, as of now, what's the outlook for Kingfisher? Can it continue to run under these circumstances?
I don't know. In fact, I'm actually surprised that things have come so far. And I think it's a case where banks have loaned a significant sum of money to the airline. It's actually significant and not so significant. It's not so significant if you look at the total amount of money loaned by banks and everything else. But if you look at one particular case, it's fairly significant. It's an exposure of around 7,000 to 8,000 crores, which is significant. $1.7 billion, which you can't wish that kind of money away. They have to recoup this in some way. So I think that's one reason why the government is keen to see this airline keep flying. The other thing is the airline employs a lot of people. Now, it's another point altogether that they haven't been paid, but the fact is they still have jobs, and they have the hope that at some point in time they'll get paid. What I'm surprised by is the fact that neither the banks nor the Civil Aviation Ministry have actually sat down with the promoters and given them a stiff deadline to do something, given them an ultimatum, a do or die kind of ultimatum, which means like you sort this out now or we take away your license. And now, of course, I think what's happened is the employees have started protesting. So the airline now has a convenient excuse. An airline's license cannot be taken away if its people go on strike. Right? Its license can be taken away for lots of other reasons. So I don't know what the Civil Aviation Ministry would do now, but if I were either in the Reserve Bank of India or in any of the other banks or in the Civil Aviation Ministry, I would have sat down with the promoter and the CEO and said, do or die. And I don't think that message has gone out, because you see pictures of the CEO and the chairman looking happy on television all the time. And to me, I don't know, I find it insulting. Right? This is an airline that hasn't paid people for 7 months, and this is an airline which has consistently seen the number of aircraft it flies come down. This is an airline which repeatedly keeps rescheduling its operations and cancelling flights. They ought to, I don't know, they ought to feel sorry for doing all this, and I don't think there's any of that. So there has to be some accountability, there has to be some responsibility. And it's up to the government to enforce that.
And the last thing I want to talk about is the US presidential debates, which we've seen this week, the first of 3, between President Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. Now, Mitt Romney in general was thought to have had the stronger debate of the two of them, and one of the things that he did quite successfully was to really harness this idea of accountability to middle-class voters, which has traditionally been more of Obama's territory. It's sort of a demographic that he addresses often. I just wondered what your take on the first debate was, and whether you agreed with the general consensus that Romney had made the stronger.
I agree with that, and I think the reason I agree with that is also because I don't particularly think Obama is good in an interactive kind of format. I think he's much better in I'm going to look into the distance and give you my vision and speak, and quite honestly, at sometimes he did sound long-winded. In contrast, Mitt Romney was crisp. He made all the right points. He struck all the right notes. And I think at the end of the day, he's a management consultant. He knows exactly what he has to say. So I think he was far better in this kind of format than Obama was. And I think that came across very, very sharply. The last time it didn't.
Right, but when you look at the polls for these kind of things, they only ever come out a couple of days later, but you often see a sort of small bounce, and a lot of people are saying that could be enough for Romney to sort of pull even with Obama.
Yeah, because when they went into the debate, the gap was around 3 percentage points or just around that. Now, that's the kind of thing that a debate can easily bridge. It could well happen because it was a very, very good performance by Romney. Nothing changes the fact that he made a lot of factual errors. Not everything he said was completely honest, but he did make those points. He made them well, and he came across as being far more confident. There was far more certitude in what he said. There was far more lucidity in what he said. Obama had a vision, and it seemed a little nebulous around the edges. It seemed a little hazy around the edges, and that too came across.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for those insights, and that brings us to the end of this edition. But thanks very much for watching, and please stay tuned for more.